you could make your way to a seat, we will get started. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Casey Tingle. I'm the Assistant Deputy Director for Hazard Mitigation for the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, and I want to thank you for being here today. If I put myself in your shoes, you probably don't know what it is you're actually attending. So you might be asking yourself, what is this? And I will speak at least for myself to say that I've been in several meetings lately where I was thinking the same thing. But it's a good question, and it's a good question because what we're here today to kick off with the Louisiana Resilient Recovery Initiative is something that is not a standard FEMA program that comes with the rules and regulations and guidelines that the typical programs are that maybe you and your entities are used to dealing with. This is an opportunity that FEMA came to us with several months ago and said we'd like to do something in addition to those programs that helps Louisiana recover from its flooding of 2016 in a more resilient way. What that is, what that looks like, how that will work is all to be developed and all to be worked through. And I want to thank FEMA for that opportunity to do that. So what's happening today is this is the kickoff. And some of us have been working on this for a few months, and it feels a little bit like we're shining one little flashlight, and we can see one or two steps in front of us, and we take those steps, and the next couple of steps become clear. Today's an opportunity to expand that circle and apply a lot more partnerships and a lot more light to that effort. The governor's going to be announcing the kickoff, and FEMA's going to be speaking to you a little bit about it, and I'll be back a little bit later to walk through some more about what this is all about. But first, I want to just thank you for being here, taking the leap to join us and to participate in this process. I also at this time have the honor to introduce Mayor President Joel Robideau, the Mayor President of Lafayette Consolidated Government and our host site for today, and to thank him for his involvement in the efforts that Acadiana is doing to work together around the issues of drainage and flood control. So it's at this time I will introduce him, Mayor President Joel Robideau.
Thanks, Casey. And let me also just thank everybody that's here, because ultimately what happens going forward as it relates to the region is going to need to be an effort that involves everybody. It's not going to be, any individual's one idea, any cities, any parishes, one idea. As we all know, the water really doesn't care. And whatever I do to help Lafayette out, it affects my neighbors, and we all know that. And we know that that's important that we look at it this regional way. I know there's a lot of elected officials here, but we are in Lafayette, so the one that I'm going to recognize unofficially first is Governor Blanco. So Kathleen, if you don't mind, thank you for coming. And thank you for this incredible facility that we're in, because it's all part of your effort, so thank you for being here. And so Guy Cormier reached out to a lot of us and started the conversation that we in Acadiana need to lead this effort. And when I say lead the effort, I mean lead the statewide effort and show other communities how it's supposed to work and how it can work. And so Guy, I appreciate your efforts in that regard, and certainly to all of the parish presidents that are here that we've had numerous meetings on. We wouldn't have gotten to this point, I don't feel like, if every one of us hadn't come together to realize that there's a better way to do things. And so Monique, thank you for putting this together based on where I had to park. I know that the turnout's probably better than expected, so I appreciate you and your staff, Rachel, for putting this together for us. And so my real reason here is to introduce the governor. So let me just say a few things and turn it over to him, because I know enough to know that no one came here to hear me say anything. So our constituents expect one thing above all else, and that's for us to put aside our differences when there is a crisis at hand and figure out what needs to be done and work in unison with each other. And as it relates to this, and this isn't in any way suggesting that there's a silver lining to the flood event, but as it relates to the August flood event, I want to personally thank and make sure everybody in here knows, and whoever's listening knows, that the governor put aside all those differences, got everybody together, and started working from day one to figure out what the steps are to go to the federal government, how to structure it at the state government level, what the locals needed. And that story's not heard enough. And the public needs to know that when we faced a crisis, we had a governor that did what needed to be done and is still doing what needs to be done. And I had a very short conversation with Pat Forbes, with the Office of Community Development for the state, and the comment was, it's not fast enough, and I appreciate that. It's never fast enough, but we know how hard you and your staff are working to get the money distributed to the individuals to get them back in their homes. And please know how much locally we all appreciate you and your staff's efforts. So I'd like to give Pat a big hand because and so without dragging this out any longer, let me just say, the governor's here today because he cares about everybody. He cares about Acadiana, he cares about North Louisiana, and he is willing and wants to work with all of us to figure out what the next steps are, what the best steps are. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the man himself, Governor John Bel Edwards.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you today, and we have folks who came from all over the state to be here in Lafayette to talk about resiliency. By the way, that's a word I had no idea that I would use as often as I've used it since I've been governor. But we do have a resilient state. Our people are extremely resilient, and there's nobody who embodies that, exemplifies that more than Kathleen Blanco. So thank you very much, Governor Blanco, for being here. The Resilient Recovery Kickoff. Appreciate your interest in being part of the process, being part of the solutions to make sure that we maximize opportunities so that we recover smarter and stronger. We've got representatives, as I mentioned, from all parts of the state, but from different sectors and backgrounds, and all of you are important. And we got folks here from all levels of government, from the federal government at FEMA to the state government at GOSEP, at community development, and of course throughout our local government structures as well, police jurors, parish presidents, mayors, you name it. It takes all of us to get this right. I want to thank FEMA for making this possible. This event represents a unique opportunity for us to expand on the traditional understanding of recovery to include coordinated efforts between FEMA and the state that promote resiliency strategies. In short, what's happened is FEMA's offered the state a pilot opportunity in selected areas impacted by the flooding in March and in August of 2016. And instead of selecting certain cities or certain parishes, what we've done at the state level is we've identified 3 watersheds that we want to receive this assistance. And those are the Vermilion Watershed here in Acadiana, and we also have the Lower Watershed up in northeast Louisiana, and the Amite Watershed in the capital area over in Livingston, Baton Rouge area. This effort has already begun here in Vermilion and will continue into the fall. And then later this year, we're going to move up to the Ouachita area, Mayor Mayo, and then over to Amite area in early 2018. These were the 3 most impacted watersheds, and they provide a variety of unique circumstances and challenges which will allow us to develop a more robust approach to share with the rest of the state. And one of the things that I decided very early on is, you know, what we've typically done after a large flood is we look and see, well, what area is flooded? Well, those structures need to be raised. And you can do that. It's very, very expensive, and it doesn't do anything to try to mitigate against future floods. And so we decided that rather than spending all of that money, all of that time raising structures, we were going to see, is there a better way to manage watersheds so that we reduce the likelihood of flooding going forward? And by the way, there's all sorts of reasons to do this. Not only do we think ultimately we'll be more successful and save money, but if you lower the base flood elevation, you actually save people money in all sorts of ways, including their flood insurance premiums. So it just makes sense to do that where we can, and that's not to say that ultimately no structures will be raised, but that's not going to be our primary focus. And we've worked with FEMA to develop this initiative from the initial offer several months ago. And what we came up with were 4 key objectives. And I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about those because I think it's important to guide our discussion, our efforts around these 4 objectives. And while they may look different from watershed to watershed because of the unique circumstances of each area in terms of geography or other conditions, they remain our overarching guidelines for engagement. Number 1, we want to develop a regional approach to decision making. Mayor Robideau talked about this a while ago. It is unique in Louisiana to approach this from a regional basis because typically folks want to get whatever their slice of the pie is and go let them do their thing. Well, the fact of the matter is there's nobody out there who's going to do a retention project or a detention project big enough to keep all the water. So it's going to go somewhere. It's going to go on to the neighbors. So why not have the neighbors sitting down all at one time to come up with one comprehensive strategy to manage the watershed? And that's what we're talking about here. You know, and we saw this in this historic flooding. And by the way, you probably know this and you may have already talked about it. But I think it bears repeating just so you know how important it is that you be here and the work that you're doing. Last year, between March and August, 56 of our 64 parishes were declared major federal disasters because of flooding. And we had record flooding in both of those areas, never before seen levels of rainfall, of flood water. And the truth of the matter is, in many areas, we don't know how bad it got because the flood gauges got washed away. So we know that we had record levels of flooding at certain rivers at certain places, but because the flood gauges were gone, we may never know how bad it actually got. So where does the water come from? Where's it going to go? We've got to have a comprehensive regional approach to this, and that's why doing it this way makes sense, so that we can implement strategies regionally that will address unique challenges. Number 2, developing and maintaining strategic partnerships. The success of this project truly relies on the partnerships that we engage. Partnerships across different levels of government, and I told you today we have FEMA here with the state, with multiple agencies in the state, and with multiple levels of parish and municipal government, but across parish lines. And that gets back to the first objective, is we got to make sure that these partnerships cross parish lines, because I promise you, floodwaters don't care about that sign at the edge of the parish that says you're leaving Lafayette and going into St. Martin. That water isn't going to say, uh-oh, let me turn around and go back to Lafayette. It's going to go into St. Martin and vice versa. You know, it's been said many times in the past 18 months across our state that floodwaters do cross those political lines, but they also cross social lines. You know, I've seen devastating flooding in some of the most affluent subdivisions in the state of Louisiana and some of the poorest. Those waters don't know, they don't care. So that's why it's imperative that we develop and expand and maintain partnerships that will make sure that we also don't know the difference between those political and socioeconomic boundaries. Number 3, we're going to develop a holistic approach to future flood risk. We're going to identify and implement sound and effective mitigation projects that are going to be a key part of our strategy to address flooding. And I'm going to make an announcement shortly about hazard mitigation grant program funding that's going to come to this region. That is a mitigation revenue source that's provided to us by FEMA. And I've been making announcements across the state. I was in Ouachita Parish recently to do that. I've also done that up in Shreveport as well. But all of those announcements, all of those efforts are going to be significant steps in the directions that we're talking about. But mitigation projects are not the end-all solution. We need to explore together how land use, stormwater management, public awareness, warning systems, and other best practices can be coordinated and combined with mitigation projects in ways that better protect our communities and our citizens. And when we do that, we will better appreciate water as an important resource that makes us unique and not merely a problem to be moved somewhere else. And at the same time, we have to be honest. We have to set expectations at a reasonable level, because no matter how good your efforts are, no matter how much money we bring to bear, there are going to be floods in the future. But we are going to mitigate against that risk as best that we can, but we cannot tell the people out there that we've solved all of their problems, because then they will be less vigilant next time we issue warnings trying to tell them what they need to do in order to protect themselves. In many areas of these floods, flood insurance is a relatively low-cost investment. At the same time, we have to continue working to address the affordability of flood insurance in higher-risk areas by working with our congressional delegation on the upcoming reauthorization and expanding participation in the community rating system. And one of the things that we can do is make sure that where we can, we lower base flood elevation. As it turned out, both of those rain events from last year in March and in August, they were outside that once in 100-year probability. And so the National Flood Insurance Program that is managed by FEMA did not take those rainfalls into account and say, okay, we got to modify our maps. But I believe these severe weather events, these extreme events, are happening more frequently. And the way we define what is 1 in 100-year probability and what's 1 in 1,000-year probability, all that's going to change. And at some point, I believe these rain events are going to drive a revision of maps. So let's do what we can between now and then to make sure that these flood insurance premiums are going to be affordable. That's critically important for the people of our state and elsewhere in the country. Number 4, developing coordinated approaches to information gathering and sharing. We've all learned so much about flooding from the challenges that we faced over the last 18 months. We need to keep learning, and one of the ways we do that is by learning from each other, because many of you have already seen certain challenges and found effective strategies to resolve those. But if you don't tell your neighbor in another parish or in another city, it's not going to have the maximum beneficial impact that it would otherwise have. So that's why it's important. That's one of the reasons it's important that we all come together and share with one another. Learning from our communities and our constituents. Learning from science and those who just have experience. And rivers are living systems. Channels change. They change their course. They change their depth. Sediments change. So we have to always make sure that we have the most up-to-date information about these systems as possible so that we can effectively predict what's going to happen with any rain event. New and better technical tools are constantly being developed. Valuable research is being performed. How do we translate and share this information so that decision makers are able to make informed choices? That's a critical question. How do we engage the historical information and voices to ensure that we build on the wisdom of what has worked in the past and what has not worked in the past? And I'll tell you something else. We got to make sure that we integrate our approach to flood control from rain with our flood controls as it relates to protecting our coast. Because at some point, those two areas come together as well. And so we always have to be mindful of that. So your presence here today, your participation, your hard work is going to pay dividends in terms of our success. And to get us started down the road, I do want to announce some hazard mitigation grant program dollars for the Acadiana region. I want to thank FEMA first for making this conference possible, but also for administering this program. And I did have a chance a couple of weeks ago to have a long conversation with the new administrator, Brock Long, and I have every confidence, every expectation that he is going to be a great partner for the state along with the president, President Trump, in continuing our efforts here. You all know, and I think Joel alluded to it, I visited this area multiple times last August and witnessed firsthand the flooding, the devastation, and the individual resiliency of the families and communities of this area. I toured homes, I met with homeowners, many of whom were completely devastated. Some had flood insurance, some didn't, but all of whom had their lives turned upside down. I met with business owners. And one of the things that we have to do is try to mitigate against that risk going forward, to minimize the frequency that floodwaters are going to invade somebody's home. And that's what these mitigation dollars are for. So following the flooding, the political leadership in Acadia, Evangeline, Iberia, Lafayette, St. Landry, St. Martin, and Vermilion, to their great credit, decided to approach the issues of flooding and drainage in a coordinated and collective fashion. And they decided to pool their hazard mitigation grant program dollars and then make consensus decisions to identify and prioritize the projects that best provide the most benefits for the region. And they did this rather than pursue parochial and piecemeal solutions that ultimately would not have served the region as well. It's harder, it requires more work, it is politically risky, but it is the right thing to do. And all of these leaders who are here with us today, I want to say thank you, because I know how easy it would be to just say, we're going to keep doing this the way we've always done it in the past. My voters aren't going to fault me for that, but ultimately you made a bigger decision, one that's actually more courageous. And so for me to partner with you and announce this funding so that you can go out and start implementing that vision, it is truly a day to celebrate. So I want to thank you all very much for your courage. Now, these projects are going to be focused on reducing flood risk and improving drainage for the region as a significant strategic investment towards recovery and addressing future flood risk in this area and in our state. In addition, the reallocation of additional Gustav and Ike funds, because when I make the announcement in just a moment, y'all can tell I'm trying to hold off on the dollar amount as long as possible. We actually have some hazard mitigation grant program funding from Gustav and Ike that we're going to be able to reallocate today to this region as well. And that will allow this region to expand some of the existing projects and to acquire some flood zone properties, flood-prone properties, I should say, because we have some repetitive loss properties out there, and ultimately the best thing to happen is to just acquire title to that, make sure that nobody has a business or a home on it in the future, and then the local government can use it for green space, put a park there, something like that. So without further ado, the amounts are as follows. For the regional approach for the August flood, the hazard mitigation grant program funding will be $25,385,971. The Gustav and Ike reallocation for Vermilion, St. Martin, Iberia, Lafayette, and St. Landry parishes, or $4,667,407. Now, the reason only some of the parishes in the region get the Gustav Ike reallocation is because you had to have been declared a disaster in that event in order to qualify for those dollars. But because you were all taking a regional approach, all 8 parishes are going to benefit from every dollar invested. So that's another reason to be in favor of your approach and to thank you all. So I want to close by thanking you for being here. Tell you that I look forward to continue to work with you. And I want to also thank the folks who work at the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, led by Jim Wascom. But Casey Tingle has done a great job with the mitigation program. And Casey, I want to thank you very much for your hard work as well. I want to thank all of the elected officials for the important role that they play in working to implement the changes and strategies necessary to ensure that we recover smarter, and stronger, because that's what being resilient is all about. If we're not smarter, if we're not stronger, then resiliency is just a buzzword that doesn't mean anything, and we're not using it to guide our efforts. And I pledge to support you in any way that I can. And I want to thank all of our other partners in attendance and tell you that it has been a pleasure to be your governor these last 18 months, but it has been a challenging 18 months. And I would just assume that the rest of this term not involve additional challenges of the type that we faced. But we don't know what's coming tomorrow. But the reason I can be so optimistic, the reason that I can feel so good about the state of Louisiana is because I know that our people are resilient. They are good, decent, hardworking people who are never better than when they are challenged. And I've seen it firsthand, and everybody in this room has, with neighbors taking care of one another when it matters most. And not just their next door neighbor, but the stranger who they come in contact with and they know that they need something. But we owe it to them. We owe it to ourselves to make sure that that happens as infrequently as possible. And that's what being more resilient in the future is about. That's why this is so important. And that's why I pray that God will bless your efforts so that we can be the state that we want to be in this regard. God bless you. Thank you very much.
All right. So next on the agenda is an opportunity to present to you formally some very important work that FEMA's been doing kind of behind the scenes and in some partnership with you over the past several months. So once the March flooding event happened in 2016 that basically covered all four corners of the state and some parts, a lot of parts in between, we started having more and more dialogue about the fact that we needed to start talking and thinking about this differently. We began those conversations, and then the August event occurred. And the August event, for those of us that live and work in Baton Rouge, happened in our backyard and took some of our team members and staff, just like it did in all of your areas. And so at that point, we had already developed the relationship with FEMA and already begun the dialogue, and the opportunity presented itself to say, let's do something that we've never done quite before and see what happens. And so today, we want to introduce to you a watershed study that covers all of the impacted watersheds across the state from both March and August. This is separate from the pilot. This study covers all of the watersheds that have been impacted from the Northwest to the North Shore and to Southwest Louisiana and Central Louisiana, all of those areas. And so the study is an important tool as we start walking through this in terms of understanding some information about these watersheds that will help us as we start to have those kinds of conversations and develop those kinds of partnerships. So it's going to be an important piece of that. The pilot effort, as the governor just described, is an area focused on starting with 3 watersheds in concert with FEMA and state partners, many of whom that are here today, to start those conversations and to start meetings and discussions about what can we do at a watershed level. What can we do that requires additional funding? what are the things that we can do in and of ourselves with making difficult political decisions or sound technical decisions to better address our watersheds. And so you're going to be hearing more about the pilot effort today, the Resilient Recovery Pilot. But I wanted to introduce to you first, early on the agenda here, the study itself, so that you can see some of the things that are in the study and how we might best build upon that study in the days and months ahead to start building the puzzle pieces around it that make the most sense for our communities. And so it's my privilege to introduce Shona Gibson, who is an engineer with FEMA Region 6. And we've basically held her hostage in Louisiana since March of 2016. I think she's finally going to get to go home at some point against all of our objections. But her partnership with us and her ongoing working relationship has been critical to making this happen. As we would come up with ideas of what if we looked at this in the study or that in the study, many of the times when we would talk about it, they had already decided to do that. And so it's my privilege to introduce Shona and her team and for her to present to you some of what is in the Watershed study that will be available to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. First of all, I just want to start, oh gosh, can you guys hear me? Okay. I just want to start out by expressing our appreciation, my team's appreciation, and how much we have appreciated this opportunity to work with you and our other state and federal partners through this process of developing this watershed study. It's never been done before, and it was quite the challenge, but it was fun along the way as well. Our sincere hope is that we have produced a tool and a product that will benefit the people who live, work, and play in Louisiana. Our desire is that these studies prove to be a useful tool and strong foundation to be built upon and used to make those shared risk-informed decisions moving forward in developing long-term resilient and recovery strategies. Like Casey said, my name is Shona Gibson. I am a civil engineer. I'm based out of FEMA Region 6. And when we're not in a disaster, I actually deliver the flood mapping program or the risk map program to the state of Louisiana. I've been doing that for 8 years. I've worked with a lot of you in this room over those 8 years. I see a lot of familiar faces. Some of you I haven't yet, but I will, I'm sure. Steve Robinson will be presenting with me. He was the task force lead for me on this whole study from January. We started the studies in January-ish, the real push. And what we've been asked to do today is basically go over what is a watershed. A lot of people we have found out don't even know what a watershed is. What does it constitute? Why is it important? So we'll go over that. We'll talk a little bit about the watershed goals. The governor actually touched on a lot of those, so it'll just be a reiteration. The watershed study goals that were identified by GOSEP in the state at the beginning and the stakeholders really match up with what the governor just talked about. We'll talk a little bit about our partnership with USGS and the annual exceedance probability calculations that they did do on the streams that they were able to do that on. Like the governor had indicated, some of the gauges broke when we weren't able to do that, but we will touch about that a little bit. We'll go over a general overview of the data that will be found in the watershed study and how it's broken up and how it's presented in the study. It's a lot of data, so bear with me. It's a lot of technical data. I'm trying to bring it down, but just I want to give everybody an overview of what's there so you know where to go and what to look for. We'll talk a little bit about LAWRS. Okay, LAWRS is the Louisiana Watershed Resiliency Study. For short, we call it LAWRS. So when I talked about LAWRS, it's talking about the overarching study. And then we'll talk about moving forward. What's next? What is our vision and the state's vision for these watersheds moving forward? Next slide. What is a watershed? Simply stated, watershed is just geographical area that collects precipitation, rainwater, and stormwater runoff from impervious areas. Basically, that surface water and that rainwater converges into streams of increasing size as you get into the lower elevations. And then the streams converge in an outflow. Sometimes it's another downstream watershed. Sometimes it's a lake, it's an ocean, or an estuary. Next slide. While topography actually defines the watershed, the United States Geological Survey, or USGS, will actually identify watersheds by unique hydrologic unit codes, which we call HUCs. Basically, HUCs range from 2 digits. Next slide. HUCs range from 2 digits, which is the largest area, to 12 digits, which is the smallest area. And we're gonna look at the AMET watershed, and we're gonna break it down. This is sometimes a really hard concept for people. So if we look at the HUC 2 watershed that the AMET watershed, which is a HUC 8, falls in, it's a regional level, it's a HUC 2, and it's the lower Mississippi Basin. We've gone ahead and overlaid that on the state of Louisiana just so you could get an idea of the size. And it actually crosses just a tiny bit over in Canada, way up there in the north. But that's the HUC 2, the lower Mississippi region. Click. The next is a subregion, and that's the HUC 4, which is a little bit smaller. And in this case, it's the lower Mississippi Lake Maurepas is the name of the watershed. And as you can see, it crosses the state line here. Next slide. This is our HUC 6, which is Lake Maurepas. Again, it's still fairly sizable here, crosses the Mississippi, Louisiana line. And then the next one is a HUC 8, which is our AMET watershed. Again, this still crosses over the state line. And our study actually looks at watersheds at the HUC 8 level. All of our study and all of our data is aggregated at that HUC 8 level. I think it's important to remember, and this really identifies it too. Not only does it cross jurisdictional and parish boundaries, but it can cross state line boundaries as well as different countries in our case. Next slide. What are our watershed goals? When GOSEP and the state approached us about this, one of the first things we asked is, what do you want out of this? What are the outcomes that you're looking for? And so we sat down with them, and they really defined it. It became very clear. It started in March. It really got nailed down in August that they wanted data-driven products. They wanted data-driven products that would help make decisions or shape decisions that would increase resiliency within a watershed. And what did that look like to them? What does it mean to have a resilient watershed? So they expressed to us in a resilient watershed, there would be fewer structures and less critical infrastructure that were damaged when flooding occurs, reducing primary costs for elevations, acquisitions, or damage and repair, and secondary costs, business loss, homeowner loss, disruption, and social services. Resilient watersheds would have updated regulatory structures and policies that incentivize the use of best practices for watershed resilience and damage prevention as development and public investment occurs. In resilient watersheds would have transportation and distribution systems, public and emergency systems, services, and utility systems that experience less disruption during adverse weather and flood events. The next goal was to provide data that informs disaster funding strategies and priorities. And what did that mean? And they were already thinking of this regional sort of approach before FEMA ever approached them with this unique opportunity for a pilot. They were really hoping that they could get regions to think together and come together and work to develop these risk-informed recovery strategies. And within the watershed, they were hoping that, or they had defined that risk-informed recovery strategy should address flooding, unmet needs, resilient features, impairments, significant natural areas, storage areas, and wetlands on a watershed level with the intent of providing greater impact across the watershed. Informed recovery strategies should promote local investment and resiliency by individuals, businesses, and communities, and support funding priorities for federal disaster recovery funds, and incorporate regulations and policies that support more resilient future development. Number 3 was that increasing the community cohesion, and not just community cohesion across parish boundaries or city boundaries, but also that community cohesion within a community, across the hall, and in those private and nonprofit partnerships that actually exist within a watershed. Develop watersheds where residents, community leaders, public agencies, and businesses understand the value of watersheds as natural systems and how upstream actions affect downstream outcomes. Develop watersheds where broad support is readily secured for public investments that improve resilience, enhance and protect environmental quality, and mitigate or prevent flood damage. And develop watersheds where social and professional organizations are knowledgeable about and engage in watershed and resilience issues, contributing diverse expertise to resilient plans and actions. And the last goal, not to the greater extent of the other ones, but it is important, is enhanced environmental quality and minimal degradation. Create watersheds where impacts from hydromodification, and we'll talk a little bit more about what hydromodification is later, but it's basically what happens to a stream as a result of what we do on the watershed. But anyways, impacts from hydromodification are reduced or eliminated through a combination of stormwater best management practices, stormwater runoff controls, and in-stream restoration, as well as some of those hard political decisions related to policies that may help that. Create watersheds where land acquisitions, park and natural areas management, community development planning, incorporate natural buffers when possible for rivers and streams, allowing for natural floodplain and river dynamics. So why study a watershed? So before we go to some of those reasons the governor mentioned, we'll actually talk a little bit about, as he mentioned, or as Casey mentioned, we've already started that first pilot watershed in Vermilion Watershed. And as part of our community engagement in the scoping phase of this effort, we have met with over 120 community leaders within the Vermilion Watershed, and we asked them a series of questions. Two of the questions were, what do you think contributes to your flooding? What is the biggest contributor to your flooding? And then the second question was, what do you see as a viable solution to solve that flooding? And we took the responses that we received from them, they were handwritten, and we inputted them into a Wordle program. And what that does is spit out a graphic, and it highlights those words that are used most. It highlights them with the amount of times it appeals in the graphic or the size. And as you can see, regional shows up there several times in large sizes. Watershed shows up there. So community leaders are already thinking that there needs to be a different approach, a less piecemeal approach. That's coming from you. That's input from leaders within a watershed. Next slide. Water does not know jurisdictional boundaries. It knows, it flows. This is Beth Watershed, I believe. Yeah. And this shows the topography of Beth Watershed. And this represents the higher elevations and the lower elevations. So the water's flowing this way. And as you can see, it crosses several boundaries all the way down to its outflow. It doesn't care where your parish boundary is, and it doesn't care where the city boundary is. What's built in a watershed or what gets applied in a watershed, pesticides, fertilizers on agricultural land, whatever happens within a watershed affects upstream and downstream neighbors within that watershed. Flood resilience strategies require coordinated action to prevent flood-related damage and to recover more quickly. And building those partnerships across parish boundaries but within the same watershed, and building stronger awareness of the watershed and its issues yields insights and solutions to increase resilience and lower flood risk collectively. Next slide. When the state approached us, we asked them, okay, this is a big effort. You know, undergoing 22, at that time it was 27 watershed studies. That's a pretty big effort. We need some resource multipliers. Who do you foresee within the state that are stakeholders and have a say and have input into this effort? And then we looked at ourselves and we looked at our internal partners and outward at our other federal partners to determine who had data that could really help feed these efforts. And it shaped up pretty clearly. The obvious stakeholders within the state included Louisiana Department of Transportation Development. They are the NFIP coordinator for the state, the National Flood Insurance Program coordinator for the state. Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. They manage the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Fund program. Office of Community Development, they manage that HUD funding that comes in. Along with Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, they have a lot of data and a lot of knowledge as it relates to that coastal area. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, we worked pretty closely with the New Orleans district. The watershed study touched 4 districts, but we really relied on New Orleans to provide us the feedback, and they would reach back out to the other 3 districts and get the data that we were asking for us. DHS, Department of Homeland Security office, little known office. I didn't know about them, of Cyber Infrastructure and Office of Cyber Infrastructure and Analysis. They really provided a lot of input related to infrastructure, what should be included in related infrastructure, economic development, economic impacts. They really turned out to be a key primary stakeholder in this whole effort. Our secondary stakeholders included the Department of Interior, Environmental Protection Agency, NOAA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the other 3 Army Corps districts to a lesser extent. But they all provided data that went in and fed and populated this watershed study. They'd provide us the data, and then we'd aggregate it at that watershed level. It's typically aggregated at a community level or a parish level, but we aggregated it on a watershed level. Next slide. Then the next question, of course, was what watersheds do we study? Do we study all the watersheds in the state? That was actually brought up. Do we just study the impacted watersheds? How do we choose which watersheds to study? And it was basically decided at that time we would study the watersheds that received significant structural impacts related to the floodwaters. So that really relied on the partnership that we had with USGS, their high watermark flagging. We did some preliminary processing of that. We were able to develop some preliminary inundation limits. Do you want to click through? And with that initial analysis for the March flooding, there were 16 watersheds that were affected. Next click. And then the August flooding, we had 10 watersheds that were affected. 4 of them were impacted by both events. Then we had some building stock, so we overlaid some building stock on there to get an idea. Overlaid the building stock and the inundation limits to get an idea. That's essentially how the watersheds were chosen at that time, before we had really good, rich individual assistance data or flood insurance claim data. And that's the inundation. Those are the inundation limits from the USGS, the final reports. Next slide. Then the next question is what's going to comprise this report? 22 studies is massive. So there is a hard copy, hard product that consists of a report. It consists of the main document. Now that main document details all the data points that we collected and why it's important. Why is this particular data important to look at in watershed planning? So it's that general overview, what it is and why it's important. Then it has 22 appendices, and there's one appendix for each watershed, and that's really where we detail and we get down to that granular data at each watershed, the very specific data to that watershed, the soils that are specific to that watershed, the geology, the topography specific to that watershed, disaster grant money that's been spent within that watershed, and it's all aggregated on that watershed level. Increase in impervious area. I never would have thought that the impact that the increase in impervious area that folks saw in Vermilion, when they saw the increase in the impervious area aggregated at that watershed level, it stopped them in their tracks a little bit. But aggregating it on that watershed level. There's a separate observation document that's available with GOSEP that they worked out observations based on all that data that was created, along with the methodology. If you give the same set of data to 2 or 3 different analysts, depending on what methodology they use, you're going to come up with a little bit different answer. So we documented the methodology we used and some of the analysis we did. The red really represents the input that we received from communities that fed the report. We do have a community survey. There is a link. The link is in the PowerPoint presentation. I think it might be in your packets. We did reach out and ask for input from the communities through a survey. We didn't get that great of a response for it. We had a backup plan. However, it is still active. You can still go to it, and you can still fill that out for us, and we will still take it and aggregate it as we move forward. Our backup was the capability assessments. We took all the parish hazard mitigation plans and the capability assessments that were done in those plans, and we aggregated them by watershed. So if you have a watershed with 28 communities in it, we took all those capability assessment questions that are in those hazard mitigation plans and aggregated them all by watershed. So now you can look at that watershed that has 28 communities, and of those 28 communities, maybe one of them has a higher standard, or 2 of them have a pre versus post development runoff standard. And it really starts to tell that bigger picture within that watershed. And the community input viewer, I'm gonna ask if you guys have not gone, if you or your engineers or any of your staff have not gone and populated this community input viewer, I would really ask that you do that. It's a very powerful tool for us to aggregate certain things. It allows you, it's a geospatial, a GIS-based platform. It allows you to go in and pinpoint, you can click a pin and identify areas that are subject to frequent flooding, roads that are closed consistently because when it rains, it's always closed. You can pinpoint areas where you have proposed drainage projects or completed drainage projects, or areas that you think FEMA needs to come back and look at to restudy for their maps. It's a really powerful tool. It allows you to provide a description in there, and you can upload photos, you can upload, Point Coupee uploaded tons of construction plans and reports related. They really went in and populated for us. So that community input viewer is still up and running as well. Then we have a digital component as well. We have a geospatial database. We will have either links to all the data that we used, National Land Cover Database, USGS inundation limits, or we'll have the data itself in our geospatial database. There will be a flash drive that's distributed that has the report on it, and then links to all these other digital areas that you can go to. And then we have a public-facing website that is live now. It is the website, and the how to access it is in your welcome packets. Vermilion Watershed is up live on it. Amy Watershed is live on it. Beth and Lower Washita watersheds are live and up on that public-facing website. It also has the geospatial database that you can go and grab the data that we use to populate the watershed studies. And all those together comprise all of LAWRS. Next slide. The 22 watersheds essentially covered, we hinted at some of these, 4 U.S. Army Corps of Engineering districts, all 8 of Louisiana Planning Development districts, 22 watersheds, 52 parishes, and 195 incorporated communities. We'll talk a little bit about annual exceedance probability. And we talk about this because everybody always wants to know what's the magnitude of the event. This was part of our partnership with USGS. We had them go out and flag high water marks, and then we had them follow up those high water mark efforts with annual gauge analysis and indirect measurements. Now, some of the gauges broke, and they weren't able to do them on all the streams, but they hit a lot of the key streams. And as you can see, really what I wanted to do here is to point out, we use the 100-year flood all the time, and we use the 500-year flood all the time. And I'll be working with community leaders in a particular parish when we're updating maps, and we'll get a constituent that comes in and says, I shouldn't be in the flood zone. We just had a 100-year flood. I'm not going to flood again for another 100 years. And that's not what the 100-year flood is. It's a statistical probability. A 100-year flood is a 1% chance of happening in any given year. And a 500-year flood has a 0.2% chance of happening in any given year. It doesn't mean it's only going to happen once. It's like spinning a roulette wheel. It can land on number 6 once out of 100 times, or it can land on number 6 3 times out of 100 times, but has a 1% chance of happening each time. And what we wanted to point out here is that Tickfaw and Tangipahoa actually received 2 fairly large events within 6 months of each other. So this, to me, highlights the importance of really strong floodplain management and higher standards in planning for that future. Flood risk changes. It's not static. It changes constantly. And just making policies and decisions on that minimum standard may not be enough anymore. Tickfaw and Tangipahoa and some of these others, if we had done those measurements, we probably would have seen the same result where we had those significant events twice within 6 months of each other. Next slide. We're going to look at impacted structures for the March event. I'm doing this for a reason too. For March, we found that 5 watersheds represented about 80% of the flood insurance and individual assistance payouts. This table, what we did here is we broke out These are just residential structures now. I don't have really good data on business structure, but residential structures. This represents residential structures that received less than a foot of inundation in the special flood hazard area, less than a foot out of the special flood hazard area, and then greater than a foot in and out. And what we wanted to do is really highlight the impact of higher standards than that 1 foot of freeboard. There is an impact here. In this case, we show potentially up to 2,081 structures could have been saved from inundation and the effects of flooding if they had been built 1 foot higher than what was required. 1 foot. Louisiana Code Council has recently adopted the International Building Code, and they striked all the freeboard requirements. And their reasoning was they want to leave it up to the locals, which is great reasoning. However, we do find in Louisiana only about 12% of the communities have a freeboard requirement, 12% of participating NFIP communities. And there is an impact. 2,083 structures multiplied by 3.5 folks per structure, that's a whole lot of people that wouldn't have had the financial stress, the emotional distress of being displaced from their homes, not to mention the dollar amounts that go around with it. I don't have the dollar amounts for all these. It was in the millions of dollars in IA and NFIP claims, and that's not even the financial impact on them because we don't make them whole again. So next slide. This is the August event. I'd like to say that 3 watersheds represent almost 80% of the NFIP and IA claims. That's not true. AMET, and the next couple slides will show that visually, but AMET was huge, huge payouts. But we had about 8,000 structures, less than a foot of freeboard in the special flood hazard area. So if those 8, now there are communities within that area that do have freeboard requirements. I don't have a way to break it down, but up to 8,000 homes may not have received impacts from flooding if there was a 1 foot of freeboard requirement. To me, that's pretty significant. Next slide. Okay, this is March, and this shows those graphs of the individual assistance and flood insurance dollar amounts that were paid out in each event by watershed. And across the bottom, we have the top 5 watersheds for each event. Well, this is March. And then the last stacked graph is all the remaining watersheds. So Beth and Lower Washita watersheds were our most impacted in March events. Beth with $69 million in payouts, Lower Washita with $58 million, Liberty Bayou Chafuncta was at $50 million, which is down in that capital area region. And then we have Tickfaw and Lower Sabine, right around $15 million. And the remaining 11 were around $11 million. Next slide. And this is August, and that's AMET. AMET dwarfs all of them. I did include Vermilion and Lake Maurepas, number 2 and number 3 for a reason. But as you can see in AMET, we had $2.2 billion of payouts and individual assistance in national flood insurance claims. Vermilion was at $293 million, and Lake Maurepas at about $272 million. The remaining 8 that were affected in August were at $262 million. So even Vermilion and Lake Maurepas, even though they're dwarfed by AMET, they still exceeded the remaining 8 watersheds. So it's pretty significant. Next slide. We talk a little bit, and we go into a lot more detail in each individual watershed on gross domestic product. This was an analysis that the Office of Cyber Infrastructure Analysis did for us. And we had them aggregate the GDP on a watershed level instead of a parish level. Everyone's used to seeing that on the parish level. So we took that and aggregated on a watershed level. And these are our top 5 watersheds in Louisiana that contribute to the daily gross domestic product and the daily dollar amounts. So for example, Vermilion is our top contributor to the gross domestic product, and it's $80 million a day in the watershed that goes to the gross domestic product. AMET comes in second at $74 million, then Bayou Teche, Bayou Sarah Thompson, and Lake Maurepas. And three of those watersheds were the most impacted watersheds over the 2 events. Vermilion, AMET, and Lake Maurepas were among the top impacted watersheds. Really highlights the importance of resiliency. If people are flooded and they can't get to work, it affects the economy pretty significantly. In each watershed, we actually break it down, and Steve will talk a little bit more about that, of the impacted GDP within the inundated area, the potential impacted and jobs in the inundated area. We talk a lot about impervious surface increase and the change in land cover. And why do we do that? So we'll put this back in your words, or in Vermilion Watershed's words. When we asked them what they felt was the biggest impact that contributed to their flooding, you can see development sticks out there, and which really just leads to impervious area. And that's not saying development's bad. Development is good. Development can be good if it's managed correctly and the correct policies are in place to manage the runoff that comes from that impervious surface. Next slide. Impervious surfaces are essentially materials through which water cannot pass. Asphalt, concrete, rooftops doesn't allow water to pass. It runs straight off of it. It reduces the area where soil infiltration can occur. It increases stormwater runoff, the volume of stormwater runoff if it's not managed, and the rate of stormwater runoff. And if that goes into the sewer and the culvert system and straight into the stream, it increases the velocity and it starts scouring and erosion within the streams. It requires stormwater management techniques to manage that increased runoff, and it results in the increased likelihood of more frequent or severe flooding when stormwater is not managed. Next slide. We did aggregate. We used the National Land Cover Database. We used the 2001 and 2011 data set and compared the 10-year increase between 2001 and 2011 in increase in impervious area. And we've listed the top 5 watersheds in the increase in impervious surface. Liberty Bayou came in, 22% increase over 10 years. Lower Pearl at 21, Red Chute at 18%. It's actually the top 8 because 4 of them are tied. Amite at 17%. And then Lake Maurepas, Beth, Bayou Pierre, and Vermilion tied at a 13% increase. Of those 8, 5 of them are in our top impacted watersheds. We also broke that down a little bit further, and we looked at the increase in the special flood hazard area. There are management and minimum guidelines to follow when developing in the watershed, in the floodplain. It's totally allowed, but we wanted to kind of get an idea of how much increase in impervious area we're seeing in the special flood hazard area. And when we did that, Red Chute Bayou was the greatest increase with a 29% impervious area increase in the water, within the special flood hazard area, followed by Amite at 21% and Liberty Bayou at 20% increase. All right, this is our dashboard. And this dashboard represents those framework pieces that we talked about, that we met with those stakeholders, those first 4 or 5 in-person meetings. And these are the data points that really came out as what was important to be included in the watershed study. And we'll go through each one of these briefly and give you a sample of the exhibits that are included in there. Now, each one of these data sets, the data is included in the geospatial database that we provide as part of the study. And then there is a geospatial exhibit that goes along with each one of these data sets in the report in each watershed appendix. And we'll start with climate and precipitation. That's the base. The first couple represent just the base, the foundation for a watershed study. Understanding the amount of precipitation along with the topography and the geology of a watershed allows planning around precipitation extremes. And these are our statewide exhibits, basically just showing the 30-year mean temperature across the state of Louisiana and showing the 30-year mean precipitation across the state. And as you can see, no surprises, precipitation increases from north to south. It's with the greater precipitation down in the Gulf area. Next slide. Soil properties. Each watershed contains a series of exhibits that shows the hydrological soil the soil properties within each watershed. Things like the drainage class, hydric soils, hydrological soil groups, flood frequency. Soil properties can help explain why certain areas are prone to erosion, experience standing water or ponding, which areas could be considered for wetland restoration, which provides storage, and which areas are better suited for water quality or flood reduction best management practices. Oh, go back. And this is just an example of Bayou Pierre watershed, and this is the hydrologic soil groups, and it's the different colors up here represent the different soils groups. So the pink here, all this pink are hydrologic soil group C. The orange color here is B. And then we go into a greater detail in each particular appendix of the importance of those related to best management practices, ponding, infiltration, does it drain well, does it not drain well. Natural resource, oh, I missed a slide. Geology and topography. Again, this is just that foundation. Understanding or having just a basic understanding of the hydrogeologic setting of a watershed is important in order to properly address water resource problems. The type and distribution of geological materials influence the response of surface water features to precipitation extremes or contaminant loadings. Studying and understand geology can provide information needed to address non-point source solutions, success of best management practice you may decide to utilize in your watershed, and other issues related to surface water. These are just the statewide exhibits. We actually go into more granular detail in each watershed, but this is a statewide exhibits that shows the geology of the state and then the topography of the state with the higher elevations up here and the lower elevations down at the south. Natural resources. Each watershed contains exhibits that shows parks, forest, preserved lands, and wetlands. We even go into some discussion about the loss of wetlands that occurred in the watershed, historical loss of wetlands. And these are important. Loss of wetlands can contribute to flooding because we lose natural storage function that wetlands provide. It also can affect, it contributes to pollution because we're losing the valuable pollutant capture that wetlands play a part in. Wetlands restorations are great and effective. They've been used all over the country as a practice to control flooding. Where soils, types, and topography allow for that, where they're suitable for reestablishing wetland plants. The floodplain, what we've done here is basically capture all the 1%, the floodplains in the area. And those are the areas that are subject to the 1% annual chance event. These are what shows on your flood maps. What's important here is 51% of Louisiana, plus or minus, give or take a few maybe, are within a special flood hazard area in Louisiana, so it's a fact of life. And I think what this highlights is the importance of that strong floodplain management, managing that development smartly and making those decisions around that. Not stopping development, but managing it and making those decisions and realizing that flood risk is just, our maps are just a snapshot and it changes constantly and it changes as development occurs, as weather patterns changes. Aquifers and water wells. We go in the general overview section, we go in pretty great detail on the aquifers that occur and are in Louisiana. And then in each individual watershed, we detail all the water wells that are present in the watershed. Public water supply withdraws over 1.7 million gallons of water, 1.7 million gallons per day from the groundwater within Louisiana's aquifers. The three highest uses are rice irrigation, public supply, general irrigation. Some of the other uses include power generation, livestock, aquaculture, industrial. Contamination is a concern from saltwater encroachment, urbanization, abandoned water wells, and contaminants from surface water runoff. But I'd like to go back to that discussion that we were having about impervious surface increase. When we're taking away pervious area for groundwater and infiltrate, and we're not providing an opportunity to collect that water and allow it to infiltrate, we're losing some of that groundwater recharge ability too. And there's a whole lot of people that are dependent on that groundwater for drinking water quality. We worked with EPA to capture water quality. They provided us, for each watershed, a list of impaired waters. And they provided us the sources of that impairment along with the causes of the impairment. And in each watershed, we provide this graphic, and the bars here do not represent, this says agriculture as a source of impairment. And the bar is way out here. And that's not indicating that agriculture is the biggest contributor to impairment for that watershed. What these different colored bars mean is those are different causes of impairment for agriculture. So for example, in agriculture, some of the causes include fecal chloroform from livestock, turbidity. There's some chemicals in there that are likely caused from fertilizers and pesticides. But what this allows you to do as stakeholders within Watershed is to really nail down and look at what those sources of impairment were and what causes it, and then allow you to start making decisions around that. You can get an idea of which ones are more caused to urbanization and development, and then allow you to shape and get a picture of what kind of practices or plans could help maybe combat some of that. Hazardous waste. Hazardous waste sites pose a risk to human life and or the environment. They contain chemical compounds that humans can be exposed of via breathing it in, ingesting, skin contact. Each individual watershed, we actually include an exhibit that shows brownfield locations, Superfund sites, whether they're in on the national priority list or not, and we go into great depth what that is in the report, what a national priority site is. And also underground storage tanks. And we show where those are along here, whether they're abandoned, whether they're active sites, where the brownfields are. And what is the... What is the hatched area? It's not on the...
It's flood inundation.
Oh, that's the flood inundation site, okay. Next slide. Drainage, hydrology, and hydraulics. I had great hopes for drainage, hydrology, and hydraulics, and we'll go in a little bit about that, but the issues related to hydrology and hydraulics within a watershed really revolve around the changes in stream geometry and stream flow that can affect the behavior of the stream. Structures placed along the streams, across streams, can impact upstream and downstream neighbors. Taking a culvert and enlarging it may sound like a great idea, but if you're causing more floor in your downstream neighbor, it's not necessarily a great idea, especially talked about it or coordinated with them. Urbanization, we've talked about that a lot. It doesn't just impact water quality, but it also causes physical degradation like scouring, undercutting, things like that within the screen, which then affects the behavior. In the report, we go in a very detailed discussion on the flow characteristics of the main stem of each watershed, not each of the tributaries, but the main stem. We talk about hydro modification and channelization, channel conditions. And what we do is we catalog the levees and dams that are found in the watershed. We did not have the capacity to do a very detailed inventory of flood control structures or major bridges and culverts. And we really encourage watersheds, especially the 3 watersheds that are part of this first Louisiana Resilient Recovery Project, to come together and get that inventory, so you have baseline inventory and know what's in the ground now, and help start shaping those, that can help shaping your plans moving forward. These are some of the exhibits we're showing. This is Liberty Bayou Chafuncta watershed. And on this side, what we've done, it's a change in impervious surface area. And the reason why we show that is that really can highlight where hydro modification has probably occurred in a stream. The different colors, the yellows and the oranges, represent different % increase in impervious area that has occurred in that watershed over that 10-year period we talked about from 2001 to 2011. And then the darker areas behind it show the concentration of impervious area in that area. We've also shown the sub-watersheds on here at that Huck 12 level, so you get an idea of where those modifications are occurring in the sub-watershed level. The other exhibit that we have here shows dams and levees within the watersheds. Here we have quite a few dams, and then down here we have about 4 little ring levees that are present there in St. Tammany Parish. But we should have this kind of exhibit for every watershed. There are some watersheds that don't have any levees in the watershed, so we won't have the levee exhibit. But if levees are present, we do show it. Land cover. Again, we talk about land cover. We take all of our data from the National Land Cover Database. We use the 2001 and 2011 data set. And the National Land Cover Database categorizes or inventories that land cover over 15 categories: high developed, high impact developed, low impact developed areas, barren land, wetlands. There's 15 categories. And the exhibits that we provide on the land cover land cover exhibits, here are some of them. Cultivated crops, deciduous forest, developed high intensity, developed low intensity, evergreen forest. Those are the sorts of categories that we're categorizing, and that's what we're showing in the land cover database, and we're showing the most recent, the 2011 data set there. Comparing historical and existing land cover can identify trends and anticipated changes within a watershed, allowing stakeholders to shape decisions around watershed-wide investments that manage stormwater runoff and reduce flood risk. And if you happen to be in a community or a parish or a watershed that has a future land use or a comprehensive plan, pairing those three data sets can be very powerful in helping to shape those decisions and make plans around land cover. So with that, I'm turning it over to Steve. He'll cover the rest of the dashboard items, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you, Shona. Nothing like having the last 5 minutes to cover the next 30 minutes of information. So, leave it to a woman, My name is Steve Robinson. I am with FEMA. I have been deployed in Louisiana for a year now, and it's been a pleasure to work on this project. As Casey said, this was initiated the end of last year, and we actually only started this endeavor in January. And within this short period of time, we mobilized several crews and a task force of as many as 40 people at one time working on this with different types of organic resources. So I think a lot of information was put together in a short period of time. These resources came from anywhere from New Jersey to California to Puerto Rico. So a lot of different folks from a lot of different areas came together because of the interest of this study and the benefit that we felt that it would provide the people of Louisiana. This study is a total of almost 2,000 pages of information. So it was our attempt to provide relevant data that answered the so what. So why is this important? And to have that information for the planners and the people to take that information, particularly in the upcoming phases of the program, to utilize that as a tool and a resource in this endeavor. So on social, economic, and demographics, we show a lot of different areas. And this is industry by number of industries and employees. We show population, different information about items at risk, salaries, educational status, employment, unemployment. And the reason why we collect this data is for an area that's called social vulnerability. And you take, in social vulnerability, 16 areas that come together and analyze what economically and what is the vulnerability of that watershed. And they rate that from a high to a low category. And you can see here in Cross Bayou from the different indications, red is high and blue is low. So there are quite a few areas that are in the moderate high indicator. Next slide. So as Shona said, we received data from the Office of Cyber and Infrastructure Analysis, gross domestic product per day. And this is the total for the 22 watersheds that we studied. And what I wanted to highlight is the top 5. You can see the spike on manufacturing at $84 million per day. You also have gas and oil extraction, mining, and quarry at $41.7 million. Real estate, I'm going to shoot you. Real estate right here and leasing is actually quite high. Public administration, $49 million. And then also healthcare and social assistance is in there. So all of the information that we cover on every watershed has this amount of data, and it has per watershed the gross domestic product per day in these 20 different categories. And if you go from watershed to watershed, you'll find an extremely different profile for each of the watersheds. So this is the total of the watersheds, the 22s that we studied. Next slide. If you look at by watershed, you can see Amite at 75 and Vermilion at 80 million, and how those two watersheds spike considerably over the other watersheds that we studied, the amount of difference. Next slide. So again, this is the top 5 or top watersheds in the March event and the August event. What we were able to do is put the flood inundation layer on the watershed with the layer of the information on GDP, and you're able to come up with the amount of dollars and jobs that are affected in that watershed for that area that was flooded. So I think this will be a very valuable tool to the local officials to say, okay, let's look at that special flood hazard area, let's look at the area that was flooded and analyze the economic impact and the impact of jobs on those areas and how important that is to the economy of that particular area. We found this very informative. Transportation, we looked at lots of different areas, but what's key here is in this information we list the types of transportation that there are: heliports, airports, and the item in parentheses here actually gives the number of those items that are found in that watershed. And then the information at the bottom also gives the mileage of interstates, U.S. highways, state highways that are inside that particular watershed. So as we analyze this and we go into critical facilities and we look at evacuation plans and we look at our transportation that's moving in and out of that watershed and what's in and out of the special flood hazard area, this again becomes a very valuable tool. The electrical infrastructure, we looked at that. We looked at transmission lines. We had the mileage of transmission lines. We looked at electrical generation units, generation plants, substations, and electrical power transmission lines. So all of this information, again, per watershed is captured in these little boxes and these little tiles, that kind of tidbits of information that you have to look at. If you look at what we call a GIS exhibit, and my guys had to educate me, but in the entire watershed we have over 900 exhibits that represent these 22 watersheds. So there's quite a lot of valuable information there. Next slide. Oil and gas infrastructure is also covered. We have the gas wells, natural pipelines, oil productivity wells, oil refineries, and then we also have the mileage on the oil pipelines and the gas lines. Next slide. Critical facilities, again, are important because of the function, the size, the area that they service, and the uniqueness. Also, the potential to cause serious bodily harm and extensive property damage if those facilities are disrupted. Next slide. So we covered these types of critical facilities: schools, cell towers, chemical facilities, power plants, and then on down to hospitals, police, and fire stations. We also covered emergency facilities where we addressed EMSs and emergency shelters. The other interesting thing that was done is we took the profile of those critical facilities and we also put the flood inundation level layer on that. and we identified those particular facilities that were in the special flood hazard area. And not only that, but if they were impacted by the flood. So you could take this information here and extrapolate that in these bar graphs, and you could see in these blue sections based on the categories, these are the actual number of facilities that are located in a special flood hazard area. And the numbers beyond that is in fact, were those facilities impacted by the flood? And I think this becomes, again, a planning tool in the future on possibly relocating some of those facilities or future development to analyze where you don't want to put some future facilities like a shelter. You may want to move it from one school to a church because that school may be in a special flood hazard area. So that's interesting. We looked at disaster and non-disaster grant funds. And for the entire studied area, HMGP was $71 million. FMA, was $59 million. Community Development Grant Fund, or CDBG, was $329 million. And this was over a period of from 2005, which is after Katrina, all the way up to 2017. Next slide. Building codes, what's interesting about this is the Louisiana State Uniform Code Council is the one that mandates the codes. And they were in the process of adopting the 2015 International Residential Code. And you'll see, particularly at this statement right here, the governor issued a suspension of putting that plan in place, which would have eliminated that free board criteria. So his executive order delayed that until June of next year to implement the new construction plan and also to eliminate the free board criteria. Next slide. The other interesting thing is we have one-page go-to information that's called the snapshot. And Sean, if you'll go next. If you, oh, go back then. Just roll it backwards. So this slide covers general information in this area with a picture of the watershed. We have the disaster grant dollars and projects. We have non-disaster grants, GDP, and then all of this is the community information, a list of the communities, and we get into the National Flood Insurance dollars that were contributed to these various communities with the properties, severe repetitive loss, and also the individual assistance claim. So it's kind of like one page, grab all the information you come to. This is the first page of all of the individual exhibits. So now I'll turn it back to Shona, and I'm only 5 minutes off our schedule.
Moving forward, where do we go from here? And I think the common theme you've probably heard over and over again today is shared goals and collaboration. And I mentioned before, we're not just talking shared goals across parish boundaries and city boundaries. Strong floodplain management involving the floodplain manager, local planner, and the building official. That's important that they work together and talk to each other. Gathering the input of the private water and nonprofit partners and stakeholders that are in a watershed, those are important. Considering the impact of projects and decisions on your neighbors, that's important. And then really, for those 3 watersheds, for those of you that are in this Louisiana recovery pilot, really taking advantage and capitalizing on the technical assistance that's going to be available to you and during that process, I think also is key. Evaluating together, coming together to evaluate where watershed planning and investments can prevent or reduce the cost of natural events. We really just want to stress that importance of those shared goals and coming together to make them. They're not always going to be easy, but I think it's important. Next slide. And if we put into the words that we've heard across the duration of these events, Kenny Mentassa, the Ascension Parish President. He said, "The time to focus our efforts on a regional drainage solution is now. Commerce, housing, transportation, and employment are more intertwined than ever. We must have a fresh assessment to comprehend fully the current floodplain and local drainage improvements." Next. This comes from Jeffrey Gearing, the State Hazard Mitigation Officer. "In order to preserve our Louisiana for future generations, we must learn from our past and incorporate that knowledge in our planning and construction in order to affect change in the recovery that is happening right now." And from the governor himself, this is a quote from him: "I believe it's imperative we make the type of investments in water management, infrastructure enhancement, floodplain management, and green infrastructure that will transform our communities into strong, resilient places that can weather any future storms." Basically what they're all saying, if we're not looking now to the future and planning for the future, tomorrow's floodplain is literally, it's here today. And what I'd like to do now, I have the opportunity, like Steve said, we had a massive amount of people work on this project over the last 8 months. And those of the team that are in here right now, could you stand? Do I have anybody still in here? Thank you. They're all in the back there. These are just a handful, and Carolyn, who came together and Doug here. Lots of late nights and discussions and lively discussions, and I am truly, truly grateful and appreciative of all of you. Steve was integral in just getting all the moving pieces to come together and work together and get people working together. Pat Forbes and his team at OCD, where's Casey? Casey and Jeffrey. My federal partners that are in here, I see Nick Sims is here. Some folks from USGS are here. I know I'm missing people. EPA, yes, are here. They were just integral, would jump through hoops whenever, and it was always, we need it yesterday, and they'd get it to us as soon as they could. So I just want to express, on behalf of just me and my team, our appreciation of that. So thank you.
Thank you, Shona and Steve. I know that is a lot of material to walk through in the afternoon, and there's not a quiz, so don't worry. You're not going to be asked to retain at least this fast all of that material. But I do want to point out that this is not a typical post-disaster deliverable. This was something that we built from the ground up through conversation and work. And I think it's safe to say that Shona and FEMA and team probably got lots of questions from other areas about, hey, what's going on over there? That's something that we're interested in. And I think tools like that are opportunities as we move forward to think outside of the box and do creative things, particularly in a post-disaster environment when information is critical and the opportunity to do those kinds of things exist. And so, again, I can't reiterate enough how thankful we are for that. And I think the true value of that information is not revealed today. It's going to be revealed in the weeks and months to come as we in our state and in your areas begin to pick up the pieces of this and say, okay, I hadn't really conceptualized how we might use that, but we had an idea, where can we get that information? And I think we'll find that we can go back to that study and begin to use it in that way. It's my privilege now to introduce the FEMA FCO, the Federal Coordinating Officer. So anytime there's a declared disaster, a Federal Coordinating Officer is appointed and works in conjunction with the state on running all things FEMA response and recovery post-disaster. And so we've been very blessed in Louisiana to have had very good relationships with our FEMA partners and our FEMA FCOs. Mr. Jerry Stoller served for a number of months following the March flooding, and then this past spring, Mr. William Doran, we call him Bill, was appointed as the FCO to take it from that point forward, and he's been a huge partner in helping us to navigate through what recovery looks like when you talk about the extent of the flooding that we had. And I think we all know what the extent of that flooding was. Nationally, it doesn't quite get that amount of attention because it doesn't have a hurricane name. It doesn't have 4 or 5 days of pre-event media deployment and storytelling that goes on. It happened, and for months we've been recovering from it, and the partnership with FEMA and the FCO has been very important in that regard. And so at this time, I'm going to ask Bill to come and say a few words.
Thanks, Casey. Let's see, they have the slide up here? I don't know if it's gonna come up or not. Oh, well, me being between you and a break is a good thing, because I'm gonna be very short, because the governor said a lot of the things I'm gonna say, so I'm not gonna say them, so that'll help you there. But I just want to say, so on behalf of Brock Long, the FEMA administrator, and Tony Robinson, our regional administrator in Denton, Texas, I want to welcome you, and as we get into this Resilient Recovery Initiative, know that it's a regional strategy, which is something unique, and the governor mentioned that. Before, we used to just build things back the way we used to build them. And now we're taking a different look at that. Our National Disaster Recovery Framework, which was instituted about 6 years ago, is now looking at a holistic approach to recovery. And I think that's really something that this is the fruits of that labor. The data you saw is going to be used so that the planning groups can focus to develop resilient recovery. Our interagency partners continue to support the mission of working with the state and communities in Louisiana to build successful recovery strategies. The state of Louisiana is a leader in this effort, so a key component is the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, the Office of Community Development, and Department of Transportation and Development, and the Regional Planning Commission. So it takes a strong effort there. And basically, you saw that we've got 3 different phases going on. The first phase is the Vermilion phase. That's where FEMA is leading it with the state supporting. Phase 2, which is going to be up in the Ouachita Buff River area, is going to be state-led but federal supported, so we're switching spaces. And then when we get over to the Tangipahoa area, when you talk about the Amite River Basin, it's phase 3. That's going to be fully state-run. So FEMA's backing out. We provided the technical assistance. We taught you how to do it. Now you're taking that data and you're going to move forward with it. So it's a great federal partnership. Looking at that data, now I know where all that money was I was signing for everybody to get through. So we're kind of paying it forward by sharing successes with the neighbors. Not only that, this is going to be an example for the rest of the nation to follow. So there's an importance here what you all are doing and what you all are getting done, so that when we do have disasters, we're going to have less impact and less federal dollars, your tax dollars, going out to recover from those. Some of the other federal agencies I just want to mention, and I know you guys did earlier, but Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration, we have Eric Leffen here. Eric, where are you? Back over here. Assistant Administrator. And then Department of Housing and Urban Development, who's a key partner not only with our CDBG funds, but also in this effort. Department of Commerce, Economic Development. Department of the Interior, Army Corps of Engineers, which obviously with the watersheds always are involved with that. U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Environmental Protection Agency, and many other federal agencies that participate in the National Disaster Recovery Framework. As we get through this, like I said, this is a unique opportunity, setting the stage, showing other folks how it can be done, so that when we get into other disasters, we can use this holistic approach to recover and become more resilient. With that, I thank you for being here, and I told you I'd be short, so I was. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for the partnership and helping us to make so much of this happen and today happen as well. Right before the break, I want to just recognize some state partners that have been key to this point and will be key to this moving forward. Office of Community Development has been a huge partner in all of recovery that we do. A lot of what they do, particularly with the Restore program, gets a lot of attention, but they're involved in a lot of other things behind the scenes. And so thanks to the Office of Community Development. We've got the Department of Transportation and Development, DOTD, has been a big help in this, and they are here today and have been working with us behind the scenes as well. The Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority is here today and been a big help. And particularly when we talk about the Vermilion Watershed and the coastal influences will be a big partner in helping us to understand and appreciate some of those factors. And the Louisiana Department of Economic Development is here today and been a partner in a lot of this recovery work as well, so I wanted to recognize them. All right, it's time for a break. I'd ask that you be back in here in 10 minutes. We got a full house, so it'll take us a little while to get back to the interior seats. So we'll take a 10-minute break and meet back here to get started at 3:30 with our first panel discussion. Thank you.